So yeah, Little Pond Oreille National Wildlife Refuge, just outside of Colville, where I'm from. And tonight we're going to talk about chickadees and nuthatches of the refuge, but also just Eastern Washington in general. So as I've done before, if some of you have seen some of my other programs I've done for you guys, you've seen those first few slides before, but I throw these in just as an introduction to the refuge. So we have about 45,000 acres total, and most of it is in the main refuge here near Colville. And then we've got 4 what we call these smaller satellite parcels, really spread out over a large chunk of Eastern Washington that we manage as well. The refuge was established in 1939, and it is predominantly forested. And it's a migratory bird refuge, which for Little Pond Oreille, migratory birds is primarily upland forest birds like woodpeckers or chickadees and nuthatches, warblers, thrushes, etc. And of course, we have a variety of other wildlife. It's not just birds. So chickadees and nuthatches, you probably know, but so I asked this question, what are they? Well, they're animals, of course, they're vertebrates, and they're birds, and they're passerines. So I've got a slide later on where all of this is a little more relevant or interesting. So, but we're going to look at 2 particular families of passerines they're actually fairly closely related genetically, and that's Paridae and Citidae, chickadees and nuthatches. We would refer to them typically. So family Paridae. Those are tits, chickadees, and titmice. So just out of curiosity, but does anybody know what this is? Yes, it is. This picture is a crested tit from England. Anybody know what tit means? And it's not what a few of you are probably thinking. The word tit is probably the only Icelandic word that we use in ornithology, but it is literally an Icelandic word that simply means small. So titmouse, for example, mouse or moose, that is, from what I understand, that is a French word that also means small. So you had the Vikings invading England in what was it, the 1200s? And then you had the Normans invading England. And so the English were taking words from some Viking words, they were taking some French words, some Anglo words, Saxon words, and we get this weird hybrid language that we call English today. So titmouse, literally, if you go back to the original words, it means small, small bird. You just said itty bitty. Yeah. But worldwide, there are 67. Oh, I hit the wrong button. I do that once in a while. There are 67 species of parids worldwide. North America, we have 13. And on the refuge in really Eastern Washington in general, we have 4. That we generally call chickadees. So what distinguishes chickadees from other birds? Well, they're small, as we just talked about, but they also have really small bills. That are really designed, so to speak. They've evolved to be probing, poking. They are picking at little crevices, and they're really adapted to pulling insects out of small spaces. They eat a variety of seeds and insects. Oh, but this one. This is actually a great tit from Sweden. This is, I believe, the largest member of the family, so it's great. So it's great, small, big, small bird. And these are actually pretty good size. I have seen these in Sweden where this picture is taken, although they range over a lot of Europe. And they are really big for a chickadee. They're about the size of they're a little bigger than a house finch or something of that size, which for their family is pretty big. So some common things among the family is they're cavity nesters. And because of that, really dependent on woodpeckers or in a lot of cases, nest boxes. Most of our species regularly take to nest boxes. And in fact, we have about 80 bluebird boxes on the refuge, and chickadees are some of the major users of those. Oh, this one, by the way. So a lot of my introductory slides, I'm using pictures of the family that are not from here just because they're cool. This is a gray-headed chickadee from Alaska, by the way. Parrots are kind of odd in that they have really complex calls, chickadee-dee-dee-dee, several notes, but their songs are really simple, just 2 or 3 notes. We'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about some of the specific species, but a lot of the kids we work with the school groups and things refer to black-capped chickadees in particular as the cheeseburger bird because it's kind of what their song sounds like. So there are 4 species on the refuge. Those are black-capped chickadee, mountain chickadee, chestnut-backed chickadee, and boreal chickadee. So we'll start looking at these black-capped chickadee, Poecile atricapillus. They're probably the most widespread of the parrots in North America. The map on the right, that is their breeding tip, which is also generally a year-round range. The map on the left, that's Christmas bird count data. So, and you see they're not that different. There's some differences. They do drift a little south in winter, but not a lot. They're generally in the same places year-round. They have a very distinctive black cap and bib, buff sides, white back of the head, white upper breast. Very flexible habitats. Of all of our chickadees, black caps are the most diverse. They pretty much will use any tree that they can find. They use a wide range of woodlands. Of course, they're cavity nesters, so at least for breeding, they're really dependent on trees. They need trees, but they're not too, unlike some of the others we'll talk about later, they're not too particular about what kind of trees. And they have this real distinctive chickadee song or call. I don't know if this is going to work or not with some of the. Yeah, some of the settings we had to change to get stuff through Zoom that it's not going to let me play the sound files. So. But they have a very simple song. That's just your 2 or 3 notes of the cheeseburger song. Yeah, somebody's whistling it back there. I actually heard them in the parking lot while I was unloading today. And they have a wide range of other vocalizations, chirps and things that they do, particularly in flocking, and a lot of flocking behavior and communications within the flock. They're omnivores. That basically means they eat everything. Most of them we're going to look at are like that. They eat seeds, but the chickadees especially eat a lot of insects, but also spiders. I was reading a paper in one of the journals a couple of years ago that at least where they were looking at chickadees in the Midwest, they actually preferred spiders over everything else during the breeding season. and they're particularly fond of spider eggs. So you see, if you've ever seen a spider nest, or the egg mass, it's basically a kind of a blob of spider webs that's got a bunch of eggs in it. Chickadees are particularly fond of those blackcaps. And as most of you know, they readily come to feeders. Particularly black oil sunflower is one of their favorites. But again, if you have chickadees at your feeder with sunflowers, you know they're pretty picky. It turns out what chickadees are doing, they pick up blackcaps in particular. They pick up a seed, and they're actually weighing it. They're comparing individual weights between seeds. And I know some researchers, I believe it was in California, one of the universities in California, they actually weighed seeds. They put weights in the seeds, glued them back together, and basically then provided them the chickadees, and found out the chickadees were actually weighing the seeds and selecting the heaviest seeds. Well, why is that? Heavier seeds simply have more oil, more fat. Black oil sunflower, they're really fatty seeds, which for you and I, fat may not be the best thing, but for a lot of wild animals, the more the better. And chickadees will, at least blackcaps, will cache a lot of seeds for the winter. So again, if you've ever watched your chickadees at your feeder, not only are they very picky about the seeds, but they're taking away a lot more than they're eating. It's because they're sticking them in the trees, little crevices in the bark here and there. They're caching them for the more lean times. And I know that our bird feeders, we keep them stocked. It's essentially an unlimited supply. But in terms of bird feeders are a relatively recent thing in the world, and chickadees are not adapted to a constant food source during the winter. So they're really genetically driven to cache food, store food, save food for later in the winter when things are really bad. And normally they wouldn't be able to find a lot of seeds in, say, January in our part of the country. So a lot of those seeds are probably going uneaten that they're taking out of your feeder because they're not hardwired to have an unlimited supply that we're feeding them. As I mentioned, they're cavity nesters, so they're really tied to trees. But again, they don't really care. They don't. They're very flexible as to what trees. So they'll use most forest types in the U.S. and Canada. And they readily use boxes. You notice the square shape to this nest in the photos because that was taken out of probably a bluebird box. Like most songbirds that nest in cavities, and a lot of people don't realize this, they actually build a nest inside that bluebird box, inside that old woodpecker hole. And chickadees and their relatives are no different. In the case of blackcaps, they weave the nest out of mosses and lichens, and then it's lined with hair and fur. Some of you are regular bird feeders may know that putting out fur. I know a lot of folks. If you have dogs and cats, you brush your cat, and you're also birders. You take all that fur that you're brushing off of your pets, and you're putting it outside for various types of birds, including blackcap chickadees, and then they'll pick at that, they'll take it off and haul it, and they're using that to line their nest. Blackcaps will lay about 6 to 8 eggs on average. 2 weeks to incubate, and then they're starting to hatch out, and then nestlings will fledge about 20 days after that. And unlike some others that we'll mention earlier, blackcaps will only nest once a year. They do tend to move around in winter. They're not so much migratory. Say The swallows we're just starting to see around Colville in the last week or so. They're headed to Mexico. Chickadees are they're headed across town. So they're what we sometimes refer as very short distance migrants or maybe elevational migrants. And they often flock with other species, especially mountain chickadees, nuthatches. I've seen them with kinglets and various other things in the winter. And another interesting thing, I came across a paper a few years ago looking at banded black-capped chickadees during the winter, and they found that nearly all, if not all, of the chickadees in their study had very strong ties to a particular wintering spot. So if you think that you have the same chickadees coming back to your feeder every winter, you're probably right. Chickadees are fairly intelligent birds, and they learn where the good food sources are. So they know that your backyard has really good food, and once they've identified that, they will keep coming back to that same yard, that same neighborhood, that same cluster of feeders, or in the wild, maybe that same patch of dormant sunflowers or insect hibernating area where they found food before, and they will basically come there every winter for the rest of their lives, expecting to find good food sources in the same places. And then so the same chickadee will come to your backyard in the fall, and he'll start pulling seeds out, and he'll stash them around the trees and around the neighborhood, basically feed on those for the rest of the winter. Spring comes, they're headed out to wherever it is they nest, and they'll be back next October or November. So moving on, mountain chickadees, Pocile gambili. Yes, named after the same ornithologist as Gambel's quail. Very similar to the blackbacks, but as you know, that black cap has a white line through it. Very, very distinctive. And the sides are more of a pale gray. The black caps have that buffy tannish color on the sides. It's pretty much all gray in mountains. And of course, mountains have a much smaller range, as the name might imply. They're primarily limited to the western mountain ranges, the Rockies, the Cascades. As you get more into Oregon and Northern California, you'll see them in the Coast Ranges as well. And they're much more closely tied with conifers than blackcaps are. Not that you won't see mountains in aspen or something like that, but particularly nesting, you're going to find them tied with the conifers. Yeah, still no luck on the calls. This is a kind of a cool one to play. I was hoping to do that, but the chickadee call is very similar to the blackcaps, but a lot of people describe it as really hoarse and kind of, or maybe very raspy version of the chickadee call. The songs are almost identical. And again, like the blackcaps, they have quite a variety of other vocalizations and calls that they do besides just the standard chickadee call, as well as the breeding season song. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I often see that out of mixed spots. Mm-hmm. And the call sometimes. Yeah. Mike, you want to repeat that question? Okay. Yeah, Kim is asking about hybridization because she has encountered it, as have I think most of us. Mountain chickadees that like this one has a little bit of a buff there. Some of there's a lot of gradations between especially the chickadee calls. I know there was what was it, 2 years ago, when WAS, the Washington Ornithological Society, had their annual meeting here in Spokane. we were doing tours at the Refuge. We had a chickadee calling that Dave Kraft and I were absolutely certain was a mountain chickadee until a blackcap popped out. So there is some variation. How much of that is dialect versus hybridization? I'm not sure. I have read about the two species hybridizing. I'm not convinced I've ever encountered it, but I can't say that I haven't. Birds, not all birds read our field guides. So they sometimes show up where they're not supposed to. They sometimes do things that they're not supposed to. They sometimes have higher or lower voices than they're supposed to. And so who knows? But I have read at least a couple of papers where, based on genetic evidence, they had hybrids. But how common is it? I honestly don't know. Mm-hmm.
So what do they look like?
It's been so long, I don't recall. But I'm sure it's like other hybrids. There's various gradations in there. And those of you who watch chickadees a lot, you will know that particularly the white line here, that will vary in size quite a bit. Again, their diet and feeding behavior is very similar to black caps. They certainly readily become the feeders. They really shift more to insects and spiders during the summer. Seeds the other 8 months out of the year. They're also selecting for the heaviest seeds. But an interesting thing about mountain chickadees, they also cast seeds for the winter. And I don't know how many of you are on the tweeters email listserv. I know some of you are because I see your names. But a couple of weeks ago, somebody put a link to a recent research publication on mountain chickadees that said at least the birds they were working with were able to remember more than 10,000 in seed locations for their winter caches. It gives the term bird brain a whole nother meaning. And we see similar numbers. I know Clark's Nutcrackers. I've seen research for them that's suggesting it's 25,000 plus different seed locations that they can remember. It truly is remarkable what the learning behavior and the memory capabilities of some of these, quote, bird brains. Mm-hmm. Not that I've read. Yeah, he was asking if the birds are selecting seeds, particularly seeds that they cache that may be more rot resistant or not, and not that I've ever read. So I have had sunflowers sprouting in my yard that I suspect were probably planted by chickadees the previous winter, but like blackcaps, they readily use boxes. In fact, we do see mountains in our bluebird boxes at the Refuge quite a bit. And they build a very similar nest to the blackcaps, made out of mosses and lichens, lined again with hair and fur. Again, a very similar nest to the blackcaps. 6 to 8 eggs, kind of the same ballpark, 2-week incubation. Again, nestlings are fledging at about 20 days. What is different is mountains will regularly nest a second time. So so they're probably at our elevation where we see them. I would guess mountain chickadees will be nesting here pretty soon, laying eggs, and would not be at all unusual to see mountain chickadees laying eggs again, say end of June, in the same box sometimes. And I don't have a lot of banded birds on the Refuge, but I suspect it's the same birds using the same cavity. Again, they move around a little bit in winter. It's not so much a true migration, but it's a very short distance thing. Mountains especially will move down in elevation in search of food. So even though they're caching, a lot of that caching is taking place in the fall after they have moved down in elevation, especially for first year birds, which have not had the opportunity to locate good cache sites to really spend time caching like their parents may have. And they frequently will flock with blackcaps. And like blackcaps, they have a fairly strong site fidelity to overwintering spots, which just simply means they come back to the same spot year after year. Our next is chestnut-backed chickadee. Name's pretty obvious on this one. They have a rusty chestnut to not just the sides, but also the back. Unlike the previous two, it's also the smallest chickadee in Washington. Yeah, the more rusty color. Their cap and bib is brown rather than black. They have a even more restricted range than the mountain chickadee, and they're even more strongly tied to a handful of conifer species, especially large, more cooler site trees like Douglas fir, cedar, hemlock, especially. Essentially, northern Rockies, Cascades, and the Coast Ranges is where we're going to be seeing. You're going to be seeing these. And I'm getting ahead of some of my points. So they also have a chickadee call. I really wish I could play this one because it is really different compared to the other two. Okay. Yeah, if somebody's got a Merlin app up or some other. Very squeaky compared to blackcaps. Mm-hmm. Like I say, it's a much more distinctive chickadee call than compared to the other two. There's your blackcap song.
This is chickadee.
Chickadee, that's where the group gets its name from, is that call right there.
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, very raspy, a lot of people would say. But yeah. Yeah, the chickadees, especially mountains, have a lot of regional dialects. So a bird in the Sierras of California, like she's playing, is going to sound a little different than what we're going to see here.
No, I mean, that could be almost a decoy.
Mm-hmm. And as you heard in some of the first recording she played, they have quite an assortment of other calls besides just the chickadee call and the song, just like the others. again, they eat seeds, they like insects and spiders, and they readily come to feeders. In fact, there's when we do the Chihuahua Christmas bird count, there's one of the sectors they have learned there's a certain house you go to, you will find chestnut-backs on their feeders pretty much every time. They're much less likely to use boxes than the other two. Again, and they build a nest where they're a little different. They use mosses, but they also use especially strips of cedar bark to weave the nest. And then they have mosses, and then that is also, again, lined with hair and fur. And the very similar structurally to the black-capped in the mountain, except for the cedar bark part. Two to 10 eggs, so a
Right.
much broader range in the
I
brood
have a
size.
question for you, and that is, do the chickadees that nest inside woodpecker holes,
Mhm.
do they prefer a particular woodpecker?
Not that I know of, but they're targeting they're selecting for certain sizes. So a smaller chickadee like the chestnut-backs, most of the chestnut nests that I've seen have been in downy holes, maybe Harry's. Generally, they don't like getting any bigger than that because they're too easy to get into. And as we'll see when we get into some of the nuthatches, there's some interesting things some of these birds do to keep things like squirrels out, and as well as insects and other unpleasant roommates. So, and the other thing is, unfortunately, these, like all of our cavity nesters, have to deal with these relatively recent invaders called starlings. So the smaller the hole, the safer it is. I've also seen actually chestnuts and rednecks, old redneck nests. But again, one of the smaller woodpeckers. Again, about 2 weeks on the eggs, and then fledging in a very similar 20-day time period. And like the mountains, they will also frequently nest a second time. Yes.
So do they lay 10 eggs and then incubate them all, or they like hawks that they incubate?
No, like most songbirds, once they're done laying, then they start incubating. So all the chicks hatch generally within a few hours, not over a period of days like a lot of your raptors do. Yes.
Black-cap. That's one.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Does that indicate to you that black-caps have a higher survivability rate than?
Not that I know of. What is interesting about blackcaps is, and I know I didn't mention it, they have an unusually long lifespan. Blackcaps, I did see one paper I think it was from Colorado, they found banded blackcaps that were at least 9 years old, which for some of the others, from like looking at the Birds of North America accounts, they're going to top out at maybe 6 or 7. So that is one advantage the blackcaps have is you only nest once a year versus twice, but you get an extra, say, 3 seasons of nesting in your lifetime. So yeah. Yeah. The other thing is going to be easier on the fledglings because they don't have to be independent near as quickly too. So I wouldn't be surprised if they have a higher survivability, but I haven't seen specific numbers on that. But they will move around quite a bit in winter. Again, they're short distance migrants, but unlike the other chickadees, they do flock up quite a bit, but very rarely with other birds. I won't say they never, but usually when you see chestnuts in the winter, they are in flocks of chestnuts. At Little Pend Oreille Refuge, Look for them in cedar, Douglas fir, like I mentioned earlier. But essentially the cool, darker conifers at some of the mid elevations. Which brings us to our last chickadee, and one of my favorites is the boreals. Hudsonicus, Hudson Bay. They have a similar pattern to the blackcaps, but the colors are a little different. The cap is more of a brownish gray. The sides are chestnut, like a chestnut-sided chickadee, but it tends to be a little more faded, a little more subdued. And the back is gray. You don't see the chestnut color on the back. And they have a fairly wide range, but it's also fairly far north. So the range is just really getting into the lower 48 here in the northern Rocky Mountain area, and also upper Midwest, Great Lakes, northern Maine, New England. So they're going to range over most of Canada and Alaska. And very, very diverse habitat use within that range. Their chickadee call is kind of an intermediate between the black-capped and the mountains. So I don't know, you're trying to bring that one up too? Mm-hmm. Okay, because there isn't one. Orioles are the only member of their family, and also extremely rare among songbirds, is that they have no territorial song that has ever been recorded, ever been identified. Yeah.
Remind me the difference between calls and songs.
Basically, songs are specifically related to breeding. They are used to mark and define territory. They're used to attract a mate, whereas calls are basically everything else. For most songbirds, you're only going to see them singing during a relatively short time period associated with the breeding season. So for a lot of birds, it's basically now through, say, maybe the end of June, maybe early July. And once they're done breeding or done really strongly defending territory, they quit singing. In most species, not all, but most, only the male sings. Some of the finches, females will sing as well as a few other types of birds as well. But generally, female songs are pretty rare. In fact, it's the only pair, like I said, the only member of its family that has no territorial song. But they do a variety of other calls besides the standard chickadee call. We heard some of those in what she played from Alaska. Yeah, it might be. Mm-hmm. She hasn't guessed yet. Okay. It's very rare, but there are a handful of records, like at the top of Blacktail Mountain Road. Do you know Warren Current? He had one up there a couple years ago, right at the top, basically right at the refuge boundary. I know of at least one other sighting on Olson Peak. A couple of other sightings near the top of Blacktail, but they're rare. I personally have not seen one on the refuge, but I know of at least 4 or 5 records since I've been there. So,
Mike, the reason I keep asking you to repeat the question is because the Zoom audience can't hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I apologize, and I just didn't do it. Her question was, she didn't realize that boreals were on the refuge, and like I said, they're quite rare, but there are a handful of sightings of them. They have really large territories that they apparently don't defend. So 13 plus acres was the average I found. And so they have the largest territories of any of the chickadees. And it's unknown how they defend or define their territories. Again, they're eating seeds, insects, spiders. They will also readily use feeders. We don't typically think of boreal chickadees as feeder birds, but where they occur closer to civilization, they do. In the mid 2000s, I had the opportunity to work in Alaska for a while, and I had a bird feeder at my apartment, and the #1 customer was boreal chickadees. Yeah, it was pretty cool. Because I had only seen a handful before I went up there. You know, they're nesting in cavities as well. Nest box use is actually pretty rare from what I could find in the literature for them. And they're building a very similar nest to what the chestnut-backs do. It's primarily moss, but also they're weaving in bark, strips of bark as well. And again, it's lined with hair and fur, similar to the other chickadee nests. 4 to 9 eggs, so again, a pretty wide range in the clutch size. They do not renest. I suspect that's at least partly related to it's a little shorter nesting season in Alaska, or at the really high elevations where they occur this far south. Again, they fledge in about 20 days. At LPO, like I said to answered to Lisa's question, we have only a handful of records. All of those are at very high elevations, typically 5,000 feet or higher. Yes.
Got the mic, so you don't have to repeat it.
All right.
So you said that they don't have a conifer preference, but I always thought spruce. And
You do see them a
that's-
lot in that.
Yeah.
I know when I was in Alaska, I saw them a lot in birches. So, and also birches and even cottonwoods. The national park where I worked, we had some really well-developed cottonwood galleries on some of our streams, and saw a lot of boreals in there. So I suspect in the particularly in the Northeast, Maine and Great Lakes, as well as in the Rockies, yeah, they're going to be in like Engelmann spruce and things like that. But as you get into Alaska, northern Canada, their preferences are a little more broad. That may simply be because they like the higher elevations, the cooler weather, the shorter summers, and though it's subalpine fir, it's Engelmann spruce that grows in that zone this far south. But you get 1,000 miles north of here, and it's a little different. So our next group, nuthatches. So these families, Paradate, Chickadees, Citidae, nuthatches, and Aegiathalidae, and I'm probably butchering that, are very closely related families. All these 3 families are the closest to genetically, are the closest to closer to each other than they are other bird groups. Which, by the way, that last one, Aegiathalidae, anybody know what those are? What family that is? Bush tits, actually, as you might expect. Very chickadee like birds. Nuthatches have a more elongated body, short tails, a narrow, again, a very probing bill design. They eat both seeds and insects. Here's where chickadees start to get in, or nuthatches start to get a little different and a little interesting. They walk up and down trees. Some of you know they're the only birds in the world that will turn around and they'll go walk down a trunk head first. Woodpeckers, tree creepers, they're obviously they're going up and down trees, but they always back down. Nuthatches will turn around and they'll go down head first. By the way, this bird in the picture, this is a Eurasian nuthatch. Anybody? And these are cool birds to me because when I was in Sweden several years ago, I saw these at the Arboretum at Lund. The Arboretum at Lund was founded by Carl Linnaeus. It's at the university to this day. And for those of you who don't know, Carl Linnaeus was a professor at that university in the 1700s. And he wrote a book on the classification of species. And he first developed this hierarchy of family, or kingdom, order, family, phylum. Kingdom, phylum, order, family, genus, and species. You know, I practiced this at least a dozen times and I never got it wrong in practice. So kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Carl Linnaeus came up with this. My life, Eurasian nuthatch, was in a spruce tree at the Arboretum at Lund that had a placard at the base of it that said, this tree was planted by Carl Linnaeus in like 1780 something. And I have this nuthatch zipping around up there, which I thought that was pretty cool. So families sit today. Worldwide, there are 29 species of nuthatches. North America has 4, and we have 3 of those 4. Red-breasted nuthatch is the most common at LPO. Sitta canadensis. Look for them in conifers. They have a very strong preference of conifers, but you really could see them almost anywhere. Like I said, a fairly wide range, but if you know something about general ecology in North America, this is also a very similar range map to most of our conifer species if you take out the southern pine forest. Like I said, they're very widespread throughout the conifer region in winter, and they're very eruptive. So this is a breeding map. This is a Christmas bird count map. The thing that I thought was kind of cool was we're kind of in the nuthatch hotspot in winter. And in fact, this is CBC data. So right there, what do you have? Spokane. And some of the highest densities, basically Spokane and Cheney CBCs are that red blob.
Mike, I have a question.
Mhm.
For the last, maybe 8 months, the red-breasted nuthatch has been really scarce around
Mhm.
here. Scarce up your way?
Not really,
They were hard to find for
but
Christmas bird count for sure.
yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in a couple more slides, but it's all about food. My guess is you probably didn't have a very good cone crop here last year. Is why that is. And Spokane area is much more heavily ponderosa pine than we certainly have a lot of ponderosa where I have, but we also have a lot of Doug firs and lodgepoles and firs and spruces and larch and so they've got more to pick from. So if ponderosa has a bad cone year, they just you feed on white pine, or you feed on larch, or you feed on spruce, or what have you. So Spokane, you're either ponderosa or you're in ornamentals of one kind or another. So they're a very frequent caller. So they're quite vocal. Oh, in this picture, speaking of nuthatches going downhill head first. Yeah, that too. The real heavy seed eaters, but especially in summer and breeding season, they're feeding pretty heavily on insects. They also very readily come to feeders like a lot of the chickadees. They cache seeds, but not as heavily as the chickadees do. They're cavity nesters. And while they readily use existing holes of all the birds we're going to talk about tonight, red-breasted nuthatches are the most likely to excavate their own cavities, especially if you've got softer trees like aspen or birch, or if you've got really punky old snags that have been rotting for a few years. They particularly like those. Or if, in this case, you've got a branch break, which has started to heal over a little bit, but you got a pretty good sized rotted out patch in there. They'll either go in there or possibly dig it out a little more. The nests are chosen by the females, but unpaired males will excavate a number of holes. One of the papers I read a couple of weeks ago putting this together, they had at least one ambitious guy excavated, I think it was 15 or 16 cavities before he found a male before he finally found a female who picked one for him. So, and these are not woodpeckers. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of energy expenditure for them to excavate compared to a lot of woodpeckers. They also very aggressively defend their nest trees. I've seen them diving on red squirrels, for example. Another interesting thing they do is they line the entrance to the nest hole with pitch. So you can see, and I've seen this occasionally. They're picking little pitch blobs off of other trees from wounds or whatever, and they're carrying that back to the nest, and they're kind of sticking it all around to basically form a barrier around their nest hole, which discourages insects, but also things like red squirrels, which are egg predators. And typical woodpecker hole, a squirrel's not going to get into, but a squirrel is going to get into a hole like this. Again, a fairly broad clutch size, a little shorter than a lot of chickadees. I mean, they're in and out in 2 weeks as far as the eggs, and then 2.5 to 3 week fledging. Redbreasts, they will stick as a family group through the winter, and then dispersal in late winter. So when you get say nuthatches on your Christmas bird count, do you see one very often, or do you see 4 or 5 together? So quite often it's that family group. Not always. And then jumping up a little bit in size, the white-breasted nuthatch. I just think this is a very sleek, I think very attractive bird for basically being just black and white. There's actually a little red on the undertail coverts, but this picture certainly doesn't show that. Sita carolinensis. Probably they were first. I don't know, because I didn't look it up, but I would bet the type specimen was probably collected in one of the Carolinas. Very, very widespread. Common over much of their range. Compared to red-breasted, very or less specific about their tree types. Well, across their range, they will use conifers, they will use hardwood trees, they will use ornamentals, they'll use whatever is available. On the refuge, they typically use lower elevations. And again, their range map is pretty broad. Everything but the heart of the Great Basin Desert and this finger of the Great Plains. I guess not enough cities in there planting ornamentals on that part of the prairies. They can be rather eruptive in the winter, depending on food sources. So again, here's a Christmas bird count map, which is pretty much everywhere except that really worst part of the Great Basin Desert. They erupt, they explode. Basically, what that means is they go south in huge numbers in some years.
The question is what?
Oh, the question is, what does eruptive mean? So eruptive just means they move south in big waves. Not typically every year. That's why it's kind of a surprise. It's an explosion. Calls are very similar to the red-breasted, but the song is a little less nasally. There we go. Yeah. Now repeat that holding your nose, and you basically have a red-breasted. They're eating seeds as well as insects and spiders. They also will frequently come to feeders, especially suet. I've found. They will cast seeds, but again, like the red-breasted, not as much as some of the chickadees will. They're cavity nesters. They primarily use existing holes, but it's not unknown, but they don't excavate near as much as red-breasteds do. Yeah, they will rarely excavate softwood. Female, again, builds a nest inside the cavity, which she selects. This is actually a picture I took on the Refuge a few years ago of, I really like this hole because when I found it the year before this, there were bluebirds in there. And from the size, I'm guessing it's probably hairy woodpecker originally excavated it. They'll build a cup, but they'll build a cup of grass inside there with shredded bark and lined with fur, but also feathers. 5 to 9 eggs, about 2 weeks. They have a little more wider range. They're and a little longer nestling period, but they're a little bigger than most of the other birds we've talked about. They more so than the other nuthatches. You'll find them in mixed species flocks in winters. And interesting enough, they prefer chickadees and titmice. And at least 2 of the papers I read said that white-breasted nuthatches are very much more wary, and they're very hesitant to feed in exposed food sites like bird feeders when there are not chickadees present. So the assumption is that chickadees are constant motion. They're also very vocal. So if there is a predator, a pygmy owl, a Cooper's hawk, a sharp-shinned hawk, a red squirrel, etc., chickadees are going to see it. And so the nuthatches have learned to depend on chickadees to be their eyes and ears, and they're very hesitant to have their head down when chickadees aren't there keeping watch out. And finally, the last bird we'll talk about tonight, pygmy nuthatch, the smallest of our nuthatches, you might expect from the name. Quite common at LPO. I encounter pygmy nuthatches not quite every day at work, but I would say at least half of the days I go to work year round, I'm going to at least hear pygmies. Lisa knows the layout of the refuge quite well. It is unusual for me to go up to the shop in the fire cache and not have pygmy nuthatches up there. They are a ponderosa pine obligate. Like the chickadees, they have a very prominent cap. And indeed, the range map, both summer and winter, is basically that's a range map for ponderosa pine. Another interesting little trivia piece about pygmy nuthatches I found is that there are a number of pygmy nuthatch skeletons have been found in the tar pits, dating to the latter part of the last ice age. So back when Southern California had a lot more pea pine and they had it in the valleys down into what is now downtown Los Angeles, there were apparently quite a few pygmy nuthatches in there, and a number of them got stuck in the tar pits. To have somebody, and a lot, those have been dated to 11,000 plus years, at least some of them. So, mhm. Yeah, I'm not surprised. Because ponderosa pine is probably one of the primary tree around there.
So there's a bit of range around the Bay Area.
Mhm.
There are not ponderosa pine there, which has always surprised me because I see them.
Yeah.
There are coastal pines that they tend to occur in, but also in Doug fir there.
Mhm.
It just seems to be a really different behavior than what you
Yeah,
think.
it is odd, but like I said earlier, not every bird has read our field guides, and they sometimes don't do what we think they're supposed to do. So we, as in scientists, we classify them and we call them ponderosa pine obligates, but which is mostly true, but every bird out in the wild hasn't read that book. And so they sometimes do things they're not supposed to do, which is part of why it's fun studying birds. Like the boreal chickadee, there is no known song for pygmy nuthatches. They call a lot. They're very vocal. Their calls are rather unnuthatch-like. They don't have that nasally call. Looks like she's getting it ready for you if you want to play it. See, that does not sound like a nuthatch. Unless you know them, then yeah, that's pygmy nuthatch, but their defended territory is limited to the nest hole, not even the nest tree, just the hole. 6 feet away, and you're welcome. Unlike most birds, pygmies flock year-round. They night roost in groups. So even during the breeding season, you'll find the males and last year's young bunching up together and roosting at night. And in fact, according to the birds of North America, well, I guess it's birds of the world now, Cornell's online data set or species account. According to that, there's no record of a pygmy nuthatch roosting by itself as one bird, with the exception of females on eggs, which isn't typically what we think of as a night roost. But females aren't going to leave the eggs. And in fact, that references one observation from the 1950s where somebody found 100 pygmy nuthatches in a single rotted tree cavity. That obviously, that's not a woodpecker hole. That's a broken branch, pretty good sized cavity. But 100 pygmy nuthatches huddled up together. Yes. The other thing is that there's tremendous thermal benefits to that in group huddling, group body heat. It's why we see, for example, bats hibernate like that in huddles. They eat a lot of seeds, but they also eat insects and readily come to suet, especially or feeders, especially suet feeders. This picture was actually from my dining room window. And if you're looking, especially the ones you can see here on the back, there's 11 pygmy nuthatches on that feeder. That's all suet. That's a suet feeder. They're cavity nesters. They primarily use existing holes. Excavating in soft wood is not unknown, but it's quite rare for them. And they will often use aspen when it's intermixed with ponderosa pine. 5 to 9 eggs, incubation in 2 weeks, fledging in 2 to 3 weeks. Yeah, it's kind of a broken record, but all these species are related. They will nest a second time. Now, here's where pygmies start to get it interesting. When threatened by predators, pygmy nuthatches, the incubating female will turn around and use her back to plug the hole and camouflage it. So think of this gray back filling the hole in gray bark. Yeah. And so like all nesting birds, they're on the lookout. They're watching, they're paying attention what's going around. So a squirrel's calling, a squirrel's in their tree. Squirrels are egg predators. So when she hears a squirrel, she hops up to the nest hole, basically sticks her back in it, plugs the hole, makes it disappear, at least visually. They also use nest helpers, fairly rare among songbirds. But nest helpers basically mean they, especially older offspring. So last year's chicks are helping to feed this year's chicks. So remember I said they have up to like 9 eggs? That's a lot of nestlings for 2 of our smallest nuthatches to feed. But it's not just the male and female. They can, those 9 chicks are going to have 4, 5, 6 birds feeding them constantly. That is pretty rare among songbirds, and it is the only nuthatch in the world to use that breeding behavior. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So her question is in a lot of birds, and there's some raptors that do this as well, where it's probably better studied. But so the question was, birds that use nest helpers like this, the nest helpers are basically restrained, or they don't try and breed on their own. And what's the advantage of that? Well, the advantage of that, or the benefit, is more reproduction overall. And so remember, for the most part, these helpers are last year's chicks. So they're sharing most of their genetic material. So from a genetic perspective, you get a much higher survival rate. One, you get it because you have more birds feeding all of those mouths. The other advantage you get is the helpers, last year's young, they basically get a practice.
Helpers are helpers because there's often some environmental constraint that there isn't territory, there isn't a nest site.
Mhm.
I'm just trying to figure out what would be.
Mm-hmm. From what I have read, it isn't so much those constraints as it is, think of it, it's more like beavers, where last year's kits are still around, they're helping take care of the young. You see the same thing a lot with wolves, for example. Last year's, typically the females are the ones that stay in the pack, but you have basically last year's young helping take care of this year's young. And like I said, the 2 advantages of that, the 2 real benefits to that are better survivability of your chicks, because they're getting a lot more food, but also for last year's young, they're getting a lot of practice. They're learning how to hunt. They're learning how to feed chicks. So when they go out next year to nest on their own, they have a much higher survival rate. Yeah, Gary.
Would the thermal benefits of, kind of flocking together, roosting together be perhaps another reason that they would stay together as a group?
Yeah, probably. So, but to go back to your question, something else I just thought of. So the first time a pygmy nuthatch nests in its life, it doesn't have any last year's young. So it has to be really good at it for last year's young to survive to become next year's nest helpers. So by practicing being a nest helper, they have more young survive the first time they nest on their own. Now they have nest helpers the second year. And so as they go throughout their lifespan, they have a much higher reproductive rate than a lot of other songbirds will. They flock in winter just like they do year round, and they're going to wander if food is scarce. And unlike the chickadees, they typically are going to be in flocks of just pygmy nuthatches. Not common, but I know I've seen at least a couple of times flocks of 100 plus pygmy nuthatches. Yeah. The cemetery at Colville is actually one of the best places to see pygmy nuthatches in the winter, but it's basically lined with ponderosa pine. And look for them in pea pine. And this slide is mostly just a cool picture, and it's kind of a transition to the end, to the closing. But this is a picture I took on the Refuge Mill Butte Trail, for those of you who know where that is. And it's actually one of my personal favorite pictures of the pictures I've taken on the Refuge is this red-breasted nuthatch. So if you're interested in more information on the Refuge, certainly take a look at our website. The Friends of Little Pend Oreille National Wildlife Refuge has a website as well. And just some thank you. A lot of some of the pictures are mine. Some of them are a lot of them are from other sources, including the online library at Cornell, the Fish and Wildlife Service Media Archives, Wikimedia, and if anybody was familiar with Thayer birding software, I was talking with Pete Thayer several years ago, and talked to him about these types of programs that I've done, and he said, "Oh yeah, use any of the pictures from my software for educational purposes. Just don't sell them, just don't print them, and or anything like that." So, and so a lot of these did come from that, and I know he's retired and that company's out of business, but I did want to give him credit for letting me use his photos. And Cornell, I don't know if they do it anymore, but about 20 years ago, I purchased an educational slide set, digital slide set from them that I'm still using. So with that, any other questions?
Yes, thank you, Mike, so much.
Mhm.
And would you lead our group on a field trip on the LPO? If we worked out into your schedule?
Yeah, it all depends on the timing. So I'm already doing one for WAS, so in I think June 11th. So if any of you are also members of that group, you can join that as well. Haven't done it recently that I know of, but I know this group used to actually come up there and camp over the weekend before COVID and things. So I don't know if you have plans to do that again, but I'm more than happy to meet up with you guys if you want to do that again too. So did you? Yeah. Yeah, I think you did, but I had some other commitment. I don't know if I was out of town or something else going on, but the nice thing about that is you, because you guys are there overnight, we can go up to one of the real regular flaminate owl sites after dark. That's always fun. That is a blue nuthatch from Indonesia. Bet you never guessed where that name blue came from. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Better to go up
395 or Highway 2 to get to,
Highway 2 is gonna go nowhere near there. You gotta go to 395.
okay.
The Refuge headquarters is about 14 miles east of Colville. So I do have some brochures up front, the Refuge standard brochures. I have some checklists. I brought a few of the friends group newsletters. Feel free to take any of that you would like. I'm trying to remember if the map in there goes as far east as Colville. I don't remember if it does, but if you can't find it, just contact us at the office. We'll be happy to email you directions from Spokane. I just did that to somebody this morning. Say, how do we get there? I said, well, where are you at? Okay, and just what's your email? I will send you a PDF that has turn-by-turn instructions from I-90 in downtown, or Colville or Newport or whatever direction you're coming from.